The Greek word Hyperborea means beyond the north wind, but for millennia it's represented something far stranger than simple geography. Ancient texts describe a paradise at the top of the world where the sun never sets, where people live for 1,000 years in perfect harmony, and where Apollo himself retreats each winter. Yet no ancient explorer ever claimed to have been there. No maps showed its coastline. The Greeks who wrote about Hyperborea treated it differently than they treated Persia or Egypt, or even distant India. They spoke of it the way we might speak of Atlantis, with a mixture of certainty about its importance and vagueness about its location. This wasn't ignorance. It was something else entirely. If you enjoy stories like this, you can like the video and subscribe for more calm, long-form journeys into ancient mysteries. Thank you for supporting the channel. The earliest references appear in fragments from poets whose works predate Homer. Hesiod mentions northern peoples living in extraordinary conditions, while the poet Aristeas claimed to have travelled far enough north to hear reports of the Hyperboreans from other tribes. These weren't travel logs. They were cosmic geography, placing Hyperborea at the axis of the world where normal rules didn't apply. The Greeks understood their world through concentric circles radiating from Mediterranean civilization, with each ring growing progressively more mythical. Hyperborea occupied the outermost ring, the place where Earth touched something beyond Earth. Herodotus, writing his histories around 440 BCE, provides our most detailed ancient account while simultaneously expressing deep skepticism. He mentions an elaborate origin story involving sacred offerings that the Hyperboreans supposedly sent to the temple of Apollo on Delos, passed through a chain of peoples until reaching the Greeks. Each community received the offerings wrapped in wheat straw and handed them to the next group in line, a relay spanning the entire known world. But Herodotus notes that by his time, the Hyperboreans had stopped sending offerings, or perhaps had never sent them at all. He refuses to discuss their location or customs in detail, stating plainly that he doesn't believe in their existence as a literal people. What's fascinating isn't that he doubted them, it's that he felt compelled to mention them at all. The Hyperboreans appeared in enough religious contexts and poetic traditions that ignoring them would have created a conspicuous gap in his comprehensive survey of the world. They were embedded in Greek religious consciousness through Apollo worship, appearing in cult practices and sacred narratives that couldn't be easily dismissed as pure invention. Something about the concept held cultural weight that transcended simple belief or disbelief. Pindar's poetry offers a different perspective, treating Hyperborea as an ideal rather than a destination. His 10th Pythian ode describes Perseus visiting the Hyperboreans and finding them engaged in elaborate festivals honouring Apollo with hecatombs of donkeys. Neither disease nor old age touches them. They live without toil or warfare, escaping Nemesis, the goddess of vengeance. This isn't ethnography, it's moral philosophy disguised as geography, using the Hyperboreans as a canvas for exploring what perfect human society might look like. Pindar makes clear that reaching Hyperborea requires more than ships or walking. No one finds the way by vessel or on foot, he writes. You'd need something else entirely, some quality beyond physical capability. The connection to Apollo runs through every ancient source like a golden thread. Multiple traditions describe the gods spending winter months among the Hyperboreans, returning to Delphi each spring when swans pulled his chariot southward. This created a sacred calendar, with Apollo's presence alternating between the Greek world and the far north. The Hyperboreans weren't merely distant people who happened to worship Apollo. They were his chosen people, the community he preferred above all others, the place he went to escape the demands of Mediterranean civilization. Their land existed in perpetual spring, with crops growing without cultivation and music filling the air constantly. They lived in groves and forests, celebrating the god's presence with endless festivals. Here's where the concept shifts into something stranger. Several sources mention that the Hyperboreans could fly, not through mechanical means or divine intervention in specific instances, but as a natural capability of their being. They transcended normal physical limitations, existing in a state that was simultaneously human and something beyond human. Pliny the Elder, compiling his natural history in the 1st century CE, mentions them living for 1,000 years and possessing such happiness that when they finally tired of life, they would crown themselves with flowers and leap from a particular rock into the sea. This wasn't suicide in the tragic sense. It was a conscious graduation from existence, chosen at the moment of perfect fulfillment. The Roman poet Ovid adds another dimension by connecting Hyperborea to the Golden Age, that primordial period when Saturn ruled and humanity lived without labour or suffering. In his telling, the Hyperboreans represent the last remnant of that perfect time, a pocket of the Golden Age that somehow survived into the degraded ages of silver, bronze and iron. They exist outside normal temporal progression, untouched by the decline that affected everyone else. Geography becomes chronology. Travelling to Hyperborea isn't moving through space, but moving backward through time to reach conditions that once existed everywhere. Apollonius of Rhodes, writing his Argonautica in the 3rd century BCE, places the Hyperboreans near the source of the north wind, beyond the Rhipaean mountains where griffins guard gold, and the one-eyed Arimaspians fight them for it. This creates a graduated mythology, where each zone northward becomes progressively more fantastic. First come the Scythians, real nomadic peoples that Greeks actually encountered. Beyond them lie the Issidones, semi-legendary peoples known only through reports. Further still, the Arimaspians with their single eyes. Then the Griffins. And finally, past all these zones of increasing impossibility, the Hyperboreans in their paradise. The structure suggests a map of consciousness rather than terrain, with each ring representing increasing distance from ordinary experience. The geographic theories of ancient scholars tried repeatedly to rationalize Hyperborea into physical space. Some identified it with Britain or Scandinavia, places so far north they seem to match descriptions of midnight sun and unusual seasonal patterns. Others suggested the Ural Mountains or regions beyond the Black Sea. Each attempt founded on the same problem. Actual exploration of these areas revealed ordinary peoples living in ordinary ways, struggling with harsh climates rather than dwelling in paradise. The more Greeks and Romans learned about northern Europe, the less room remained for Hyperborea on literal maps. It retreated steadily northward, ahead of expanding geographical knowledge, always just beyond the edge of confirmed territory. This retreat points toward the concept's true function in ancient thought. Hyperborea served as a philosophical and spiritual pole, a fixed point of perfection against which actual societies could be measured. When Plato described his ideal republic, he was working in the same tradition that produced Hyperborean myths, using an imagined perfect society to explore real political and ethical questions. The Stoics, developing their cosmopolitanism, needed the concept of an ideal human community to contrast against the flawed city-states they actually inhabited. Hyperborea provided that standard, a place where humans achieved their full potential without the compromises and corruptions that seemed inevitable in real political life. But there's something else happening in these texts, something that becomes visible only by reading them collectively. The Hyperboreans don't merely live well. They live in direct relationship with cosmic forces that other peoples experience only at a distance. Their land sits at the axis of the world, the point where the celestial pole meets the earth. The north wind, Boreas, blows from their territory, making them literally beyond its reach while everyone else shivers in its blast. They exist at the hinge point between earth and heaven, mortal and divine, time and eternity. Their 1,000-year lifespans suggest not just longevity, but a different relationship to temporal flow, living so slowly that a millennium feels like a normal human lifetime. Several sources mention the Hyperboreans sending sacred offerings to Delos through that elaborate relay system, but the reverse flow matters more. Apollo's annual journey to Hyperborea created a spiritual circuit, with divine energy flowing north in winter and returning south in spring. This movement structured the entire Greek religious calendar and influenced agricultural cycles, social festivals, and political activities. The Hyperboreans weren't passive recipients of divine favor. They actively participated in maintaining cosmic order through their relationship with Apollo, performing some essential function that allowed the god to renew himself and return each year with restored power. The mystery traditions, those secret religious practices that promised initiates knowledge about life, death, and the divine, incorporated Hyperborean symbolism in ways that surviving sources only hint at. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the most famous of these secret rites, involved a journey of the soul that participants couldn't describe to outsiders under penalty of death. But fragments suggest this journey moved through various cosmic zones, including a northern paradise that closely matched Hyperborean descriptions. The mysteries promised escape from the cycle of birth and death, achievement of a blessed state after mortal life ended. Hyperborea provided a geographic vocabulary for describing this state, a way of talking about transcendence using the language of place. What the Greeks were mapping wasn't physical territory. They were mapping human potential, spiritual possibility, the far reaches of what existence might become under ideal conditions. Every culture creates these maps using whatever symbolic vocabulary their worldview provides. The Greeks used geography, placing their ideals at the edges of the known world, where ordinary rules need not apply. They needed Hyperborea to exist somewhere, even if that somewhere remained forever inaccessible to normal travel. Its existence as a concept was more important than its existence as a place. This understanding helps explain why ancient authors could write about Hyperborea with such specific detail, while simultaneously admitting they didn't know where it was, or whether it existed at all. They weren't confused or dishonest. They were working within a symbolic system that modern readers often misunderstand by applying literal expectations to metaphorical content. When Pindar says, "No one reaches Hyperborea by ship or on foot," he's not describing a navigation problem. He's explaining that you can't get there by physical means, because it exists in a different category than physical locations. The Romans inherited Greek Hyperborean traditions, but transformed them through their own cultural lens. Roman authors, more pragmatic and less mystically inclined than their Greek predecessors, treated Hyperborea with even more skepticism, while still preserving the stories. Pliny's Natural History catalogues Hyperborean traditions alongside reports of dog-headed men and people whose feet point backwards, creating a geography of wonders that educated Romans would have recognized as entertaining rather than factual. Yet even in this skeptical context, Hyperborea retained special status. Pliny devotes more space to the Hyperboreans than to many of his other marvelous peoples, suggesting the concept held continuing cultural relevance despite disbelief in its literal truth. The early Christian era saw Hyperborean traditions begin their long transformation into medieval and modern forms. Church fathers, combating pagan philosophy, occasionally referenced Hyperborea as an example of vain Greek speculation about earthly paradises, when the only true paradise existed in the kingdom of heaven. But they also inadvertently preserved the concept by arguing against it, ensuring that educated medieval readers would encounter Hyperborean myths in theological texts even after the original pagan sources became rare. A strange preservation through opposition, where the thing being criticized survives precisely because the criticism was copied and transmitted. Byzantine scholars, maintaining classical learning while the Western Roman Empire collapsed, continued copying ancient texts that mentioned Hyperborea. Their libraries preserved works by Pindar, Herodotus, and Pliny that would otherwise have vanished during the upheavals of late antiquity. These manuscripts eventually made their way back to Western Europe during the Renaissance, carrying Hyperborean traditions to new audiences who would interpret them through very different cultural frameworks. But that transformation belongs to a later part of this story, when European scholars would rediscover classical learning and project their own obsessions onto ancient myths. What matters for understanding the ancient concept is recognizing its essential ambiguity. Hyperborea was simultaneously real and unreal, a place and not a place, at the edge of the world and beyond the world entirely. This wasn't confusion or primitive thinking. It was sophisticated symbolic work, using the vocabulary of geography to discuss questions that transcended geography. The ancient writers were mapping consciousness, not coastlines. They were describing human possibility, not population statistics. When we read their accounts as failed ethnography or mistaken geography, we miss the entire point of what they were trying to communicate. Modern scholars have spilled considerable ink debating which real location might have inspired Hyperborean legends. Britain, Scandinavia, the Baltic coast, and various other northern regions have all been proposed as the historical basis for the myth. These investigations reveal interesting patterns in how ancient geographical knowledge developed and how information about distant peoples got distorted through multiple retellings. But they also risk reducing a rich philosophical and spiritual concept to a simple case of mistaken identity. The Hyperboreans weren't Britons or Scandinavians that Greeks heard about and misunderstood. They were an entirely different kind of construct, serving entirely different purposes in ancient thought. Understanding those purposes requires grasping how differently ancient peoples conceived the relationship between myth and reality. Modern thinking creates sharp boundaries between factual and fictional, insisting that something must be either true or false, either real or imaginary. Ancient thinking operated with more fluid categories, recognizing that different kinds of truth existed, and that symbolic or mythological truth could be more important than factual truth in many contexts. Hyperborea was mythologically true, carrying real meaning and serving real functions in Greek, religious and philosophical life, regardless of whether it corresponded to any physical location on Earth. As we continue tracing Hyperborea's influence through history, we'll see this ancient conception repeatedly misunderstood and reinterpreted by later ages that lacked the cultural framework to grasp its original meaning. Medieval scholars would transform it according to Christian cosmology. Renaissance humanists would try to rationalize it through improved geography. Enlightenment thinkers would dismiss it as primitive superstition, and modern esotericists would inflate it into something the ancients never intended, creating elaborate pseudo-histories that bear little resemblance to the original concept. Each transformation tells us more about the people doing the transforming than about Hyperborea itself. But before we can understand those transformations, we need to see how the concept evolved during antiquity itself, how it spread beyond Greece into Roman culture, how it interacted with other mythological traditions about northern peoples, and how it gradually faded from active belief, even while remaining embedded in literary and philosophical traditions. The story of Hyperborea in the classical world reveals patterns that will repeat throughout its later history. As each new age discovers the concept and molds it to serve contemporary needs, while believing itself to be uncovering ancient truth, the transformation of Hyperborea from Greek philosophical concept to Roman literary commonplace began not through conquest or cultural exchange, but through the peculiar dynamics of how Romans approached Greek learning. Roman intellectuals simultaneously admired Greek culture as vastly superior to their own, while insisting on Roman political and military supremacy. This created a strange relationship, where Romans consumed Greek ideas voraciously, but often stripped them of their original context and purpose, treating them as decorative elements for Roman literature rather than living philosophical concepts. Virgil's Georgics provide the earliest significant Roman treatment of Hyperborea, But the way he uses the concept reveals how profoundly Romans misunderstood or deliberately reinterpreted what Greeks had meant by it. In Book 3, Virgil describes frozen northern lands where daylight and darkness each last 6 months, where snow never melts, and where inhabitants must shelter in caves beneath the earth. He explicitly mentions the Riparian Mountains and peoples living beyond the north wind's domain, but his account focuses exclusively on the harsh environmental conditions, rather than the spiritual perfection Greeks had emphasized. For Virgil, the far north represents extremity and hardship, not transcendence. This shift in emphasis reflects broader Roman attitudes toward geography and empire. Romans thought territorially, measuring the world through military conquest and administrative control. They could conceptualize distant regions as either conquered, conquerable, or strategically irrelevant, but they struggled with the Greek notion of a space that existed primarily as philosophical metaphor. When Virgil describes the far north, he's cataloguing the limits of the habitable world, defining the boundaries beyond which Roman civilization cannot extend. The blessed status Greeks attributed to Hyperboreans becomes, in Roman hands, merely an acknowledgement that people somehow survive in impossible conditions. Pliny, the elder's natural history, demonstrates how Roman encyclopedic ambition transformed Hyperborea into a curiosity to be catalogued rather than a concept to be contemplated. Pliny mentions Hyperboreans in his geographical sections, placing them north of the Riparian Mountains alongside various other exotic peoples. He repeats Greek claims about their longevity and happiness, but as straightforward ethnographic facts rather than symbolic attributes. His account reads like a travel writer describing a distant tribe based on second-hand reports, noting their customs and characteristics without any deeper philosophical engagement. What's particularly revealing is how Pliny treats Hyperborean longevity. Greek sources had used extraordinary lifespans to indicate proximity to divine existence, suggesting that Hyperboreans lived differently because they existed in a different relationship to time and mortality. Pliny simply records that they live a very long time, sometimes up to 1,000 years according to his sources, as though this were a biological peculiarity, like unusual height or coloration. The symbolic significance drains away, leaving only the spectacular claim stripped of its meaning. Roman poets found Hyperborea useful as a literary device for indicating extreme distance or impossibility. Horace uses it this way in his odes, mentioning Hyperboreans as inhabitants of impossibly remote regions that serve as rhetorical markers for as far as anyone could possibly go. The poetic function here resembles how modern writers might reference Timbuktu to indicate remoteness without any real interest in the actual city. Hyperborea becomes a name rather than a concept, a word that signals distance without carrying its original philosophical weight. Ovid's Metamorphoses includes a curious episode involving Boreas, the north wind. But even here, the Hyperboreans themselves remain shadowy presences, defined mainly by their location beyond Boreas, rather than their spiritual attributes. Ovid was certainly capable of philosophical sophistication in his treatment of mythology, but he seems to have found nothing in Hyperborea that sparked his interest in transformation and metamorphosis. The concept's static perfection, its resistance to change and development, apparently offered nothing for his particular poetic project. The one Roman author who engaged more deeply with Hyperborea's philosophical dimensions was Pomponius Mela, whose geography treatise preserved some of the Greek spiritual associations while adding Roman practical concerns. Mela describes Hyperboreans as living in perpetual peace, devoted to Apollo, and experiencing unusual day-night cycles. But he also emphasizes their agricultural practices, social organization, and relationship to surrounding peoples in ways that ground the account in more concrete ethnographic observation. Even when trying to preserve Greek philosophical content, Roman sensibilities push toward practical description. This Roman transformation of Hyperborea had lasting consequences because Roman texts became the primary means by which later European civilizations encountered Greek ideas. Medieval scholars would read Pliny and Virgil, not Pindar or Hecataeus. Renaissance humanists would encounter Ovid and Horace before gaining access to earlier Greek sources. The Roman interpretation, which emphasized exotic geography over philosophical symbolism, became the default understanding of what Hyperborea meant. Only much later, when scholars could read Greek texts directly, would the original conception become recoverable. The gradual Christianization of the Roman Empire created new complications for Hyperborea's status. Early Christian writers inherited the Roman geographical tradition, but needed to reconcile pagan mythological content with Christian truth claims. Their solution typically involved treating mythological peoples and places as distorted memories of biblical events, or as demonic deceptions designed to mislead pagans. Hyperborea fell into an awkward category, neither important enough to warrant extensive theological attention, nor easily dismissed as obviously false. Augustine's City of God mentions various pagan claims about blessed peoples living at the world's edges, but treats them with skepticism bordering on dismissal. He acknowledges that pagans believed such things, but offers no Christian reinterpretation or explanation, apparently considering the entire topic too trivial to deserve serious engagement. This dismissive attitude would characterize most patristic treatment of Hyperborea, leaving the concept in a strange limbo where it wasn't actively condemned, but also wasn't incorporated into Christian cosmology. Some early medieval writers did attempt to locate Hyperborea within Christian geographical frameworks, often by identifying it with biblical peoples or post-flood migrations. These efforts produced confused results because the writers were trying to reconcile incompatible systems. Greek philosophical geography, Roman territorial thinking, and Christian biblical literalism couldn't be smoothly integrated. The resulting hybrid accounts placed Hyperboreans in various northern locations, while stripping away both their pagan religious associations and their philosophical significance, leaving only scattered geographical references that made little coherent sense. The preservation of classical learning in Byzantine Greek scholarship maintained better access to original sources, but even Byzantine writers showed declining interest in Hyperborea as a living concept. They copied and commented on ancient texts that mentioned it, but their annotations typically clarified geographical references rather than exploring philosophical implications. Byzantine scholars were superb textual preservers, but often treated ancient texts as historical artifacts to be maintained rather than as sources of active philosophical engagement. Islamic scholars who translated Greek geographical and philosophical works into Arabic encountered Hyperborea through these multiple layers of interpretation and reinterpretation. Their geographical treatises mention northern peoples living in extreme conditions, but the connection to Apollo and Greek religious concepts made the material less interesting to Islamic scholars than other aspects of Greek learning. Mathematical and astronomical content from Greek sources received intense attention and development, but mythological geography remained marginal to Islamic intellectual concerns. The medieval European rediscovery of classical learning, through Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek texts, created yet another transformation of Hyperborea. The concept reached medieval scholars filtered through Roman, Christian, Byzantine, and Islamic interpretive layers, each of which had altered its meaning and emphasis. What remained was mostly confusion, scattered references to northern peoples with unusual characteristics, living in regions with strange day-night patterns, somehow connected to ancient Greek religion in ways medieval Christians found difficult to comprehend or irrelevant to their concerns. Medieval maps occasionally included Hyperborea in their depictions of northern regions, but its placement varied wildly because map makers were working from contradictory sources that couldn't be reconciled. Some maps placed it in Scandinavia, others near the Arctic Ocean, still others in mythical territories beyond the edge of the known world. These geographical confusions reflected deeper conceptual confusion about what kind of place Hyperborea was supposed to be. Medieval cosmology had categories for earthly kingdoms, for paradise, for hell, and for various spiritual realms. But Hyperborea fit none of these categories comfortably. The Norse exploration and settlement of Iceland and Greenland during the Viking Age created interesting complications for Hyperborean geography. Medieval writers aware of these northern settlements sometimes wondered whether Vikings had reached Hyperborea or lands beyond it. But the obvious paganism of Norse culture and the harsh conditions in their northern settlements matched neither the blessed spirituality nor the perfect climate that ancient sources attributed to Hyperborea. If anything, Norse expansion demonstrated that real northern lands were brutally difficult to inhabit, not paradises of perpetual spring and ease. Some medieval writers attempted to distinguish between multiple northern regions, suggesting that Hyperborea lay beyond even the furthest Norse settlements, in unknown Arctic territories that would remain forever inaccessible. This approach preserved Hyperborea's status as a limit concept, while acknowledging that known northern lands didn't match ancient descriptions. But it also reduced Hyperborea to a placeholder for unmapped territory, draining away its philosophical content while maintaining its geographical mystery. The recovery of Greek texts during the Renaissance created opportunities for European scholars to engage with Hyperborea in something closer to its original context. Humanists who could read Pindar and Herodotus in Greek encountered the concept without the distorting layers that medieval transmission had introduced. But Renaissance scholars brought their own interpretive frameworks that were just as distant from ancient Greek thinking as medieval frameworks had been, though in different ways. Renaissance enthusiasm for ancient wisdom and Prisca Theologia led some scholars to treat Hyperborea as a real place where ancient knowledge had been preserved. If Greek philosophers had learned from Egyptian priests, and Egyptian priests had preserved antediluvian wisdom, perhaps that wisdom had originated in Hyperborea before spreading southward to civilized lands. This speculative reconstruction created elaborate narratives about knowledge transmission that ancient sources never suggested, but it felt intellectually satisfying to Renaissance scholars, seeking to unify all ancient wisdom traditions into a single genealogy. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on biblical authority and its rejection of Catholic tradition paradoxically increased Protestant interest in pre-Christian ancient history as a source of religious truth uncorrupted by papal distortion. Some Protestant scholars suggested that Hyperboreans had preserved pure monotheism or fragments of Adamic wisdom that could supplement biblical revelation. These theories required considerable imaginative reconstruction because ancient sources said nothing about Hyperborean monotheism. But that absence of evidence didn't discourage scholars convinced that northern peoples must have possessed special spiritual knowledge. Catholic scholars generally showed less interest in these speculations, maintaining traditional patristic skepticism about pagan mythological geography. But the intellectual energy came increasingly from Protestant Northern Europe, where scholars had additional motivation to identify their own regions as historically significant centers of ancient wisdom rather than barbarous backwaters civilized only by Roman conquest and Christian mission. If Hyperborea had existed in Northern Europe, and if Hyperboreans had possessed special knowledge, then perhaps modern Northern Europeans were heirs to that tradition. This Northern European appropriation of Hyperborea would intensify dramatically in subsequent centuries, transforming it from a marginal curiosity in classical scholarship into a central concept in racial theories and nationalist mythologies. But those developments required additional intellectual and political changes that hadn't yet occurred during the Renaissance. What Renaissance scholars established was the framework for treating Hyperborea as a real historical place, whose location and significance could be debated, rather than as a philosophical concept whose meaning needed to be understood. That shift from meaning to location, from symbol to place, would enable all the stranger developments that followed. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and empirical investigation should have demolished Hyperborean speculation entirely. Instead, it transformed the myth into something stranger and more persistent. 18th century scholars developed new methods for investigating ancient claims through comparative linguistics, systematic ethnography, and what they considered scientific approaches to human origins. These tools promised to resolve ancient mysteries through rational inquiry rather than speculation. Hyperborea became a test case for these methodologies, and the results revealed more about Enlightenment assumptions than about ancient realities. Johann Gottfried Herder's investigations into the origins of language and culture positioned Northern Europe as a crucial zone for understanding human development. His theories about folk poetry and national character suggested that different peoples preserved distinctive cultural essences shaped by their environments and histories. Hyperborean traditions, if they could be recovered, might reveal something fundamental about Northern European identity that had persisted despite centuries of cultural change. This wasn't mystical speculation, but what Herder considered empirical investigation of cultural patterns observable in language, folklore, and custom, the comparative method that revolutionized 18th century linguistics, created new frameworks for connecting ancient references to modern populations. When scholars identified systematic relationships between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and Germanic languages, they established the Indo-European language family and opened questions about where these related languages had originated. Some linguists suggested that the original Indo-European homeland lay in northern regions, making ancient references to Hyperborea potentially relevant to understanding this ancestral population. The evidence for northern origins remained thin, but the theoretical possibility transformed Hyperborea from pure myth into a hypothesis that linguistic data might confirm or refute. Jean-Sylvain Bailly proposed the most elaborate Enlightenment theory connecting Hyperborea to human origins in his Letters on the Origin of Sciences and on that of the peoples of Asia. Bailly, an accomplished astronomer whose scientific credentials lent authority to his speculations, argued that advanced civilization had originated in northern regions during a period when the Earth's axis had a different tilt, making Arctic areas temperate. As the axis shifted and climates changed, these northern peoples migrated southward, bringing their knowledge to regions that would become known historical civilizations. Ancient references to Hyperborea preserved memories of this original northern homeland. Bailey's theory attempted to reconcile biblical chronology with emerging geological evidence for Earth's great age and climate changes. If advanced civilization had existed in the far north before known history, that would explain both ancient traditions about northern wisdom and the apparent suddenness with which complex societies emerged in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The theory required dramatic geological changes that evidence didn't support, but Bailey considered his framework more scientifically rigorous than traditional interpretations that treated ancient myths as pure fiction. Contemporary critics identified the theory's speculative leaps and a lack of physical evidence. Why would advanced northern civilizations leave no archaeological traces? How could axis shifts occur rapidly enough to force migration within human historical memory? What mechanism would have caused such dramatic geological changes? Bailey's responses relied on assumptions about lost evidence and incomplete geological knowledge rather than positive proof. But his astronomical expertise and systematic presentation made the theory influential despite its evidentiary gaps. The political implications of northern origin theories became increasingly significant as European nation-states developed more sophisticated ideologies connecting contemporary populations to ancient predecessors. If civilization had originated in northern Europe rather than the Mediterranean or Near East, that reversed traditional hierarchies of cultural prestige and suggested that northern peoples possessed distinctive capabilities that explained their historical achievements. These weren't yet racial theories in the biological sense that would develop in the 19th century, but they established frameworks for treating northern populations as fundamentally different from and potentially superior to southern peoples. British scholars showed particular interest in theories that emphasized northern European distinctiveness, because they supported narratives about Anglo-Saxon political institutions and cultural characteristics. If Germanic tribes that had invaded Britain descended from advanced northern populations, that explained the apparent success of British political and economic systems as expressions of innate northern capabilities rather than contingent historical developments. Hyperborea provided ancient precedent for treating northern peoples as culturally advanced rather than barbarous, reversing Roman and Christian narratives that had positioned civilization as flowing northward from Mediterranean sources. The French Revolution's upheaval and subsequent Napoleonic Wars intensified interest in national origins and cultural distinctiveness as Europeans sought stable sources of identity amid political transformation. Romantic nationalism emphasized the unique genius of different peoples expressed through language, folklore, and historical tradition. Hyperborean theories fit naturally into these frameworks by providing Northern Europeans with an ancient heritage that rivaled or surpassed classical Mediterranean civilization. The absence of direct evidence became less important than the emotional and ideological satisfaction these theories provided. German scholars developed the most sophisticated linguistic and philological approaches to investigating Indo-European origins, establishing methodologies that would dominate 19th century research. The Grimm brothers' work on fairy tales and mythology suggested that authentic folk traditions preserved ancient cultural memories that sophisticated literary sources had lost. If Hyperborean traditions had survived in Northern European folklore, careful collection and analysis might recover them. This approach transformed Hyperborea from a classical reference into something allegedly alive in contemporary peasant culture, waiting to be recognized by scholars with appropriate interpretive frameworks. The problem was determining which folklore elements represented genuine ancient traditions and which were recent inventions or borrowings from other cultures. Scholars developed elaborate criteria for identifying supposedly authentic material, but these criteria often reflected their own assumptions about what ancient northern culture must have been like. Stories that fit expectations for Hyperborean traditions were deemed authentic, while inconvenient material was dismissed as corrupted or foreign. This circular reasoning produced conclusions that confirmed initial assumptions, while appearing to follow rigorous methodology. Franz Bopp's systematic demonstration of Indo-European linguistic relationships established the comparative method on firm scientific foundations, but it also raised questions that purely linguistic evidence couldn't answer. Languages revealed patterns of relationship and change, but they couldn't determine where ancestral populations had lived or what their cultures had been like. Archaeological evidence remained limited, and what existed often contradicted Romantic theories about advanced ancient northern civilizations. Northern Europe's archaeological record showed gradual cultural development rather than sudden appearance of sophisticated societies. The tension between Romantic nationalist desires for glorious northern origins and accumulating evidence for gradual cultural development created interpretive challenges that different scholars resolved in different ways. Some abandoned Hyperborean theories as inconsistent with evidence. Others modified their theories to accommodate archaeological findings, while maintaining core claims about northern cultural distinctiveness. Still others dismissed contrary evidence as incomplete or misinterpreted, insisting that future discoveries would vindicate their theories about ancient northern civilization. Esoteric and occult movements emerging during the late Enlightenment and early Romantic period found Hyperborea particularly appealing because it could be positioned beyond empirical investigation, while still claiming historical reality. If Hyperborea had existed in prehistoric times and left no archaeological traces, that made it perfect for esoteric speculation, unconstrained by physical evidence. Occultists could attribute any characteristics they desired to Hyperboreans, while dismissing demands for proof as misunderstanding the nature of esoteric knowledge. Freemasonry's interest in ancient mysteries and lost wisdom incorporated Hyperborean themes into elaborate degree systems and ritual narratives. Some Masonic authors suggested that the craft's origins lay in Hyperborean wisdom traditions that had been transmitted through Egyptian and Pythagorean initiates before reaching medieval stonemasons. These narratives served Masonic institutional needs by providing ancient pedigree and mysterious origins, but they also influenced how educated Europeans thought about ancient history and knowledge transmission. Masonic versions of Hyperborean theories circulated widely because many influential intellectuals and political figures belonged to lodges where they encountered these ideas. Theosophy and related movements would later develop even more elaborate Hyperborean mythologies, but their foundations were laid during this period when esoteric movements established frameworks for treating ancient myths as encoded wisdom, accessible only through special interpretive methods. The distinction between exoteric and esoteric knowledge became central to these systems. Surface meanings in ancient texts were deemed inadequate or deliberately misleading, while true significance required initiation into proper interpretive approaches. This methodology made Hyperborean theories unfalsifiable, because any evidence against them could be dismissed as exoteric misunderstanding. The scientific racism that would dominate 19th century anthropology began developing during the Late Enlightenment as scholars attempted to classify human populations and explain differences they observed between groups. Early racial theories emphasized climate and environment as shaping human characteristics, but they increasingly suggested that these environmental influences had created permanent differences that persisted even when populations moved to different regions. If northern climates had produced distinctive human types, those types would retain their characteristics and capabilities regardless of where they lived. Hyperborea fit naturally into emerging racial frameworks because it provided ancient precedent for northern racial distinctiveness and superiority. If an advanced civilization had existed in Arctic regions, that demonstrated northern peoples' ability to thrive in challenging environments and develop sophisticated cultures under conditions that would have defeated lesser races. The theory suggested that northern racial characteristics represented adaptations to demanding climates that had selected for intelligence, discipline, and creativity. These were supposedly scientific explanations, but they reflected political and cultural assumptions more than biological evidence. The transition from Enlightenment rationalism to Romantic nationalism fundamentally altered how Europeans approached questions about cultural origins and identity. Enlightenment thinkers had generally emphasized universal human reason and the possibility of progress through rational inquiry. Romantic nationalists stressed the unique genius of different peoples and the importance of maintaining cultural distinctiveness rather than pursuing universal values. Hyperborea served both frameworks, but in different ways. For Enlightenment rationalists, it was a hypothesis about human origins that evidence might confirm or refute. For Romantic nationalists, it was a symbol of Northern European cultural identity that expressed something essential about their people's character and destiny. The malleability of Hyperborean myth made it useful for diverse and often contradictory purposes. Scholars could invoke it to support theories about language origins, cultural diffusion, racial characteristics, or esoteric wisdom transmission. Each interpretation selected different aspects of ancient sources, while ignoring elements that didn't fit. The myth's vagueness in original sources became an advantage because it allowed maximum flexibility for modern appropriation. Ancient authors had left Hyperborea deliberately undefined, and modern theorists exploited that openness to project their own concerns and assumptions onto the ancient concept. Educational systems in Northern European countries began incorporating narratives about ancient Northern greatness that drew explicitly or implicitly on Hyperborean theories. Students learned that their ancestors had possessed advanced civilization, when Mediterranean peoples were supposedly primitive, or that northern racial characteristics explained modern European dominance. These educational narratives served nation-building purposes by creating shared identity and pride in collective heritage. The historical accuracy of these narratives mattered less than their political and cultural functions. By the early 19th century, Hyperborea had been transformed from a marginal reference in ancient texts into a central concept in Northern European cultural identity and emerging racial ideologies. This transformation hadn't occurred through discovery of new evidence about the ancient concept. Instead, it reflected how modern Europeans had appropriated ancient references to serve contemporary needs for cultural legitimacy, racial superiority, and national pride. The myth's journey from ancient philosophy to modern ideology was nearly complete. What remained was for these intellectual and cultural developments to merge with political movements that would weaponize Hyperborean theories in ways ancient Greeks could never have imagined. The intellectual developments transforming Hyperborea into a racial and nationalist symbol found their darkest expression when German folkish movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries merged mythological speculation with political activism. These movements rejected both liberal democracy and socialist internationalism, advocating instead for a return to supposedly authentic Germanic culture rooted in mystical connections between race, land, and ancient wisdom. Hyperborea provided these movements with everything they needed: ancient northern origins, racial purity narratives, and esoteric knowledge that distinguished initiated Germans from other peoples. Guido von List emerged as the most influential figure in developing occult Ariosophy that placed Hyperborea at the center of Germanic spiritual history. Born in Vienna in 1848, List claimed to have experienced mystical visions revealing ancient Armanic wisdom that Germanic priests had preserved through millennia despite Christian suppression. According to his elaborate mythology, the original Aryans had inhabited Arctic regions before catastrophic climate change forced migration southward. These Hyperborean ancestors had possessed advanced spiritual knowledge and technological capabilities that degenerate modern civilization had forgotten. List's system combined selective readings of Norse mythology, invented etymology, and complete fabrication to create comprehensive pseudo-historical narratives about Germanic origins. He claimed that ancient runes were not merely an alphabet, but a sophisticated system encoding esoteric wisdom accessible only to initiated priests. The Armanen Futhark that List presented as ancient Germanic spiritual technology was actually his own invention, created by reducing the historical Elder Futhark from 24 to 18 runes to match the number of verses in a particular Old Norse poem. This methodology typified Völkisch scholarship, which felt no obligation to distinguish evidence from imagination. The Armanen order, that List founded in 1908, attracted members from Austrian and German middle classes seeking spiritual alternatives to Christianity and material explanations for their society's problems. These seekers found in List's teachings a satisfying narrative that explained modern difficulties through reference to ancient racial decline. According to Armanen doctrine, Germanic peoples had once ruled vast territories through spiritual and technological superiority derived from their Hyperborean heritage. Racial mixing and Christian contamination had weakened these capabilities, but initiated Germans could recover ancient powers through proper spiritual practices and racial purification. Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels developed even more explicitly racist applications of Hyperborean mythology through his Ariosophy, which combined occult speculation with vicious anti-Semitism. Lanz claimed that original Aryans had been godlike beings with electrical organs and telepathic abilities, inherited from their Hyperborean ancestors. Racial mixing with subhuman species had degraded these capabilities, producing the inferior races that now contaminated Germanic bloodlines. Only through strict racial separation and selective breeding could Germans recover their ancestral Hyperborean powers. The magazine Ostara that Lanz published from 1905 to 1931 disseminated these ideas to audiences that included a young Adolf Hitler, who purchased back issues from Lanz personally in 1909. While debates continue about the direct influence of Lanz's specific theories on Nazi ideology, the broader Völkisch milieu that both inhabited shared fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy, ancient Aryan greatness, and the necessity of racial purification. Hyperborea functioned within this milieu as mythological justification for political programs of exclusion and domination. The Thule Society, founded in Munich in 1918, represented the most direct connection between Hyperborean mythology and Nazi political organization. Named after the ancient Greek reference to the farthest northern land, the society combined folkish racial theories with practical political activism aimed at combating communism and establishing authoritarian nationalist government. Society members, including Rudolf Hess, Alfred Rosenberg, and Dietrich Eckart, played crucial roles in the early Nazi Party's development, providing intellectual frameworks and financial support that enabled Hitler's rise. Thule Society mythology held that Germans descended from Hyperborean supermen who had inhabited Arctic regions before geological catastrophe forced southern migration. These ancestors had established advanced civilizations, including Atlantis, which some members located in the North Atlantic rather than following Plato's Mediterranean references. The society's emblem featured a swastika superimposed on a sword, combining the ancient symbol that Volkish movements had appropriated as Aryan racial marker with imagery of militant activism. Meetings involved elaborate rituals invoking ancient Germanic gods and celebrating racial purity. The relationship between Thule society occultism and Nazi political ideology remains contested, with some scholars emphasizing direct influences, while others argue that Volkish mythology provided atmospheric background rather than operational doctrine. What's undeniable is that many early Nazi leaders moved within occult circles where Hyperborean theories circulated freely. Whether or not Hitler personally believed in Hyperborean supermen mattered less than the broader cultural context where such ideas seemed plausible to educated Germans seeking explanations for national humiliation after World War I. Nazi ideology synthesized Volkish mysticism with pseudoscientific racism in ways that made Hyperborean references simultaneously mythological and supposedly historical. Alfred Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, published in 1930, presented comprehensive racial history that traced Germans to Nordic origins characterized by creativity, honor, and natural aristocracy. While Rosenberg's dense philosophical prose avoided explicit Hyperborea references, his Nordic racial mysticism drew heavily on the same Volkish traditions that had elaborated Hyperborean mythology. The book sold over 1 million copies, demonstrating the broad appeal of narratives connecting Germans to ancient northern greatness. Heinrich Himmler's obsession with Germanic prehistory led to creation of the Ahnenerbe organization in 1935, ostensibly dedicated to researching ancient Germanic culture, but actually functioning as pseudo-academic arm of SS racial ideology. Ahnenerbe expeditions to Tibet, Antarctica, and various European sites sought evidence for ancient Aryan civilizations and superior Nordic racial origins. While these expeditions failed to produce credible evidence for their mythological claims, they demonstrated how thoroughly Hyperborean theories had penetrated Nazi institutional structures. The Ahnenerbe's 1938 Tibet expedition, led by Ernst Schaffer, exemplified Nazi efforts to find physical evidence supporting racial mythology about Hyperborean origins. The expedition's stated purpose involved zoological and anthropological research, but underlying motivations included searching for remnants of ancient Aryan civilizations that supposedly had migrated from Arctic regions through Central Asia. Expedition members conducted anthropometric measurements of Tibetan populations seeking racial characteristics that might indicate Nordic ancestry, photographed religious artifacts that might reveal Aryan influences, and collected specimens that might document ancient migration routes. The expedition produced no evidence supporting Hyperborean theories, but Nazi propaganda presented it as confirming ancient connections between Germanic and Tibetan cultures. This pattern repeated across Ahnenerbe activities. Predetermined conclusions shaped research design. Negative results were ignored or reinterpreted, and propaganda trumpeted supposed discoveries regardless of actual findings. The organization's archaeological excavations throughout occupied Europe operated similarly, seeking evidence for Germanic cultural superiority, while destroying or ignoring artifacts that contradicted racial narratives. Nazi education systems incorporated Völkisch mythology about ancient Nordic greatness into curricula designed to instill racial consciousness in German youth. Students learned that their ancestors had created the world's first advanced civilizations, that Nordic racial characteristics explained German cultural achievements, and that maintaining racial purity was essential for national survival. While explicit Hyperborea references remained relatively rare in official curricula, the broader narrative structure derived directly from Völkisch traditions that had elaborated Hyperborean mythology over previous decades. The catastrophic consequences of Nazi racial ideology demonstrate the dangers inherent in mythologizing ancient origins to serve contemporary political purposes. Hyperborean theories contributed to intellectual frameworks that justified genocide by establishing hierarchies between supposedly superior Nordic races and inferior others. While complex factors produced the Holocaust, the cultural context where educated Germans found racial mythology plausible enabled political programs that treated human beings as racial specimens to be preserved, improved, or eliminated according to pseudoscientific theories. Post-war efforts to denazify German culture required confronting the Völkisch mythology that had provided intellectual foundations for Nazi ideology. Scholars documented the invented character of supposedly ancient Armanic wisdom, exposed the fraudulent methodology behind racial anthropology, and demonstrated how Völkisch movements had systematically distorted historical evidence. Yet Hyperborean theories proved remarkably resilient, persisting in neo-Nazi movements and evolving into new forms that continued attracting adherents, seeking ancient legitimacy for racist ideologies. Savitri Devi emerged as the most significant figure in post-war Nazi occultism, developing elaborate mythology that combined Hyperborean theories with Hindu philosophy and environmental mysticism. Her book The Lightning and the Sun, published in 1958, presented Hitler as avatar of destructive deity Shiva, destined to purify the world through violence. According to Devi's mythology, Aryans originated in Arctic Hyperborea before catastrophe forced southern migration into India and Europe. Hitler's mission involved recovering ancient Hyperborean wisdom and establishing new golden age through elimination of racial inferiors. Devi's influence extended through multiple generations of neo-Nazi movements, providing mythological frameworks that allowed adherents to maintain faith despite Nazism's military defeat. Her writings circulated through underground networks, inspiring figures like Miguel Serrano, who developed even more elaborate esoteric Nazism combining Hyperborean mythology with UFO theories and hollow Earth speculation. These developments demonstrated how mythological thinking could survive repeated empirical refutation by retreating into increasingly esoteric formulations immune to evidence-based criticism. The emergence of neo-Völkisch movements during the 1970s brought renewed attention to Hyperborean theories within European and American far-right circles. These movements rejected explicit Nazi identification while maintaining core Völkisch assumptions about racial hierarchy and ancient Aryan greatness. Publications like The Scorpion, edited by Michael Moynihan, promoted Völkisch mysticism to audiences interested in Norse paganism, black metal music, and European cultural identity. Hyperborea functioned within these subcultures as symbol of authentic European culture uncorrupted by Christianity, modernity, or multiculturalism. The relationship between neo-Völkisch cultural production and explicit political organizing remained ambiguous, with promoters typically denying racist intentions while employing rhetoric and imagery saturated with racial meaning. This strategy of plausible deniability allowed Völkisch ideas to circulate more widely than explicit Nazi propaganda could, reaching audiences who might reject overt racism but found romantic narratives about ancient European greatness appealing. Hyperborean mythology proved particularly effective for this purpose because its associations with Nazi ideology could be downplayed while its romantic appeal to ancient northern origins was emphasized. Academic study of Völkisch movements and their use of ancient mythology developed substantially from the 1960s onward, with scholars documenting how nationalist and racist ideologies had systematically distorted historical evidence. Nicholas Goodrick Clarke's The Occult Roots of Nazism, published in 1985, provided definitive analysis of Ariosophy's development and influence, demonstrating how figures like Liszt and Lance had invented traditions they claimed to recover. Leon Polyakov's The Aryan Myth traced the broader history of racist interpretations of Indo-European linguistics and mythology, showing how Hyperborean theories fit within larger patterns of ideological appropriation. This scholarship established clear distinctions between legitimate historical research and Völkisch pseudo-scholarship. Yet Hyperborean theories continued attracting adherents undeterred by academic refutation. The persistence of these ideas, despite overwhelming contrary evidence, reveals important truths about how mythology functions in modern contexts. For believers, Hyperborea represents something beyond historical claim, subject to empirical verification. It embodies cultural identity, racial pride, and spiritual meaning that factual correction cannot address, because the myth serves psychological and social needs unrelated to historical accuracy. Contemporary white nationalist movements continue invoking Hyperborean mythology to establish ancient precedent for racial consciousness and European solidarity. Websites, podcasts, and social media accounts promote Völkisch theories to audiences seeking alternatives to liberal multiculturalism and egalitarian social norms. These modern promoters typically avoid explicit Nazi references while maintaining core Völkisch assumptions about racial hierarchy and the necessity of preserving European genetic and cultural heritage from contamination by inferior races. The internet has enabled unprecedented dissemination of Völkisch ideas, allowing isolated individuals to connect with like-minded seekers and access materials that mainstream publishers reject. Online communities dedicated to Norse paganism, European martial arts, and folk music provide entry points where Hyperborean theories circulate alongside apparently apolitical cultural content. This integration of racist mythology with broader cultural interests makes Völkisch ideas more accessible to audiences who might reject explicit white nationalism but find romantic narratives about ancient European greatness compelling. Understanding Hyperborea's journey from ancient geographical speculation to modern racist mythology requires recognizing how mythological thinking operates independently of historical evidence. The theory's persistence across 2 centuries, despite repeated scholarly refutation, demonstrates that its appeal derives from cultural and psychological needs rather than empirical support. Hyperborea provides believers with ancient legitimacy for contemporary racial consciousness, mythological depth for cultural identity, and esoteric knowledge that supposedly distinguishes initiated Europeans from others. The transformation of Hyperborean mythology from racist pseudo-history into contemporary spiritual practice accelerated during the 1990s as New Age movements appropriated Völkisch concepts while claiming to transcend their political origins. This spiritual repackaging proved remarkably effective at introducing Hyperborean theories to audiences who would reject explicit racism but found alternative spirituality appealing. Books like Jocelyn Godwin's Arctos, The Polar Myth in Science, Symbolism and Nazi Survival, presented Hyperborea as esoteric tradition worthy of serious metaphysical consideration rather than discredited racial ideology, creating intellectual frameworks that sanitized Völkisch concepts for consumption by spiritual seekers unfamiliar with their Nazi pedigree. Godwin's scholarly approach distinguished between historical claims about polar civilization and symbolic interpretations, treating Hyperborea as mythological representation of spiritual principles. This distinction allowed readers to engage with Hyperborean mythology while distancing themselves from its racist applications, though the practical effect often involved reintroducing Volkish concepts under spiritual rather than political justifications. The book's extensive documentation of Hyperborean theories across multiple esoteric traditions created impression of ancient wisdom tradition rather than modern racist invention, lending credibility through sheer accumulation of historical references, regardless of their actual scholarly merit. New Age publishers like Inner Traditions and Bear and Company released numerous titles exploring polar mythology, ancient civilizations, and lost spiritual knowledge that incorporated Hyperborean themes within broader alternative history frameworks. These publications typically avoided explicit racial language while maintaining core Volkish assumptions about ancient Aryan wisdom and spiritual superiority of northern peoples. Authors like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval, though not primarily focused on Hyperborea, created intellectual environments where ancient advanced civilizations seemed plausible, making specific Hyperborean claims appear less extraordinary by comparison. The Internet's emergence as primary medium for alternative knowledge dissemination revolutionized how Hyperborean theories circulated and evolved. Online forums dedicated to alternative history, ancient mysteries, and esoteric spirituality enabled rapid exchange of ideas between proponents from different traditions, creating syncretic Hyperborean mythologies that combined Volkish racial theories with New Age spiritual concepts, ancient astronaut hypotheses, and various occult traditions. This digital bricolage produced Hyperborean theories more complex and varied than earlier Volkish formulations, incorporating elements from theosophy, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and modern conspiracy theories into comprehensive alternative worldviews. YouTube channels and podcasts exploring alternative history found Hyperborean mythology particularly suitable for visual and audio presentation formats that emphasize dramatic speculation over rigorous analysis. Programs like Ancient Aliens occasionally featured Hyperborean theories within broader ancient astronaut frameworks, while numerous independent content creators developed entire channels dedicated to polar mythology and lost northern civilizations. These productions typically combined legitimate archaeological imagery with speculative narration and dramatic music, creating emotionally compelling content that circumvented critical analysis through aesthetic presentation and narrative pacing designed for entertainment rather than education. The rise of social media platforms enabled Hyperborean mythology to spread through image-based content that communicated core concepts without requiring engagement with complex textual arguments. Memes featuring maps of ancient polar continents, artistic reconstructions of Hyperborean cities, and inspirational quotes attributed to Volkish authors circulated widely across platforms like Pinterest, Instagram, and Tumblr, reaching audiences who might never read lengthy expositions of Hyperborean theory, but absorbed its basic premises through repeated exposure to visually appealing content. This mimetic transmission proved remarkably effective at normalizing Hyperborean concepts within online alternative spirituality communities. Contemporary neo-pagan movements display complex relationships with Hyperborean mythology that range from explicit embrace to conscious rejection, depending on their specific traditions and political orientations. Asatru and other Norse-focused pagan groups face persistent challenges from Volkish members who insist that Germanic paganism inherently belongs to people of Northern European descent and connects practitioners with Hyperborean racial spiritual heritage. These Volkish practitioners argue that authentic Norse paganism requires racial consciousness and rejection of universalist approaches that welcome practitioners regardless of ancestry. Mainstream pagan organizations have generally responded through explicit declarations that their traditions welcome all sincere practitioners, regardless of race, creating folkish versus universalist divisions that mirror broader cultural conflicts over identity and belonging. Groups like the Troth publish statements condemning racism while acknowledging historical connections between pagan revival movements and Volkish ideology, attempting to preserve Norse cultural traditions while rejecting racial interpretations. This tension between cultural specificity and universal accessibility remains unresolved within contemporary paganism, with Hyperborean mythology serving as a particularly contentious symbol because its Volkish origins make claims about innocent cultural interest difficult to sustain. Academic study of how Hyperborean mythology functions within contemporary culture has expanded significantly since 2000, with scholars from religious studies, anthropology, and communication examining how ancient mythology gets repurposed to serve modern ideological needs. Matthias Gardel's Gods of the Blood provided comprehensive analysis of racist paganism in America, documenting how white nationalist movements appropriated Norse mythology and Volkish theories to create religious justifications for racial separatism. Jeffrey Kaplan's work on radical religion explored how esoteric racism functioned within broader extremist movements, showing Hyperborea's role in providing mythological depth to contemporary white nationalism. These scholarly analyses revealed how Hyperborean mythology enables believers to construct comprehensive alternative worldviews that explain contemporary social conflicts as manifestations of ancient spiritual struggles between races. Within this framework, modern multiculturalism represents continuation of ancient conflicts between Hyperborean Aryans and inferior races, while racial consciousness becomes spiritual awakening to eternal truths rather than bigotry. This mythological interpretation transforms political positions into cosmic principles, making racial ideology seem like natural order rather than ideological choice. The relationship between Hyperborean mythology and conspiracy theories tightened considerably during the early 21st century, as both traditions increasingly shared online spaces and ideological frameworks. Conspiracy theories about global elites suppressing ancient history meshed seamlessly with Hyperborean claims about lost Aryan civilizations, while theories about racial differences in intelligence and behavior provided pseudo-scientific support for Volkish assumptions about Hyperborean genetic legacy. This convergence created comprehensive alternative knowledge systems, where Hyperborean mythology functioned as historical foundation for understanding contemporary conspiracies. QAnon and related conspiracy movements occasionally incorporated Hyperborean elements into their complex mythologies about ancient evil and contemporary resistance. While not central to these movements, Hyperborean theories provided additional layers of historical depth and esoteric significance that enhanced conspiracy narratives' emotional and intellectual appeal. The malleability of Hyperborean mythology made it easily adaptable to various conspiracy frameworks, functioning as floating signifier that could be attached to different ideological projects according to specific needs and audiences. Contemporary artistic engagement with Hyperborean mythology ranges from uncritical reproduction of Volkish themes to sophisticated critique, exploring how mythology gets weaponized for political purposes. Black metal music particularly struggles with this legacy, as early Norwegian black metal deliberately employed Volkish imagery and ideology as transgressive aesthetic choices, creating ongoing debates about whether such references can be divorced from their ideological content. Bands like Burzum explicitly promoted Volkish ideas, while others claimed aesthetic interest in mythology divorced from political implications. Visual artists working with Nordic themes face similar challenges when engaging with imagery and symbolism saturated with Volkish associations. Contemporary Norse-inspired art must navigate complex terrain where traditional symbols have been appropriated by racist movements, making innocent cultural expression difficult to distinguish from coded political messaging. Some artists respond through explicit anti-racist statements accompanying their work, while others avoid problematic symbols entirely, and still others deliberately reclaim Volkish imagery for anti-racist purposes through ironic or subversive deployment. The gaming industry's fascination with Norse mythology and ancient civilizations has inadvertently provided additional channels for Hyperborean concepts to reach mainstream audiences. Video games featuring Viking themes, ancient mysteries, and lost civilizations often incorporate elements derived ultimately from Völkisch theories, though typically stripped of explicit racial content. Games like Skyrim and God of War present Norse-inspired worlds where ancient power and wisdom reside in northern settings, reinforcing basic Hyperborean assumptions about northern origins of civilization, without requiring players to engage with underlying racial ideology. This aesthetic appropriation of Hyperborean themes creates ambiguous cultural products that can be enjoyed as pure fantasy, while simultaneously reinforcing Völkisch assumptions about northern cultural superiority. Game developers typically lack awareness of these mythologies' ideological origins, treating them as neutral cultural resources available for creative exploitation. The resulting games introduce millions of players to Hyperborean-derived concepts within entertaining contexts that encourage emotional identification rather than critical analysis. Educational responses to Hyperborean mythology's persistence have evolved from simple debunking toward more sophisticated approaches that examine why such theories remain appealing despite lacking empirical support. Teaching about Hyperborea now typically involves exploring how mythology functions in modern contexts, why people find alternative histories compelling, and how to distinguish between legitimate scholarly uncertainty and pseudo-archaeological speculation designed to support ideological agendas. This pedagogical shift recognizes that factual correction alone proves insufficient when myths serve psychological and social needs beyond historical accuracy. Critical thinking education increasingly uses Hyperborean theories as case studies demonstrating how to evaluate extraordinary claims, recognize logical fallacies, and understand how cognitive biases affect belief formation. Students examining Hyperborean mythology learn to identify cherry-picking of evidence, circular reasoning, unfalsifiable claims, and other characteristics of pseudo-scholarship. This approach treats Hyperborea not merely as false claim requiring correction, but as opportunity to develop broader analytical skills, applicable to various forms of misinformation and ideological distortion. The relationship between legitimate archaeological discoveries and Hyperborean mythology creates ongoing challenges as new findings about ancient human migrations and climate history get misappropriated to support Völkisch theories. Genetic studies revealing complex patterns of ancient population movements get interpreted as confirming Hyperborean dispersals, while evidence for sophisticated Northern European cultures during Ice Age periods gets presented as supporting polar civilization theories. This pattern demonstrates how scientific progress can paradoxically strengthen pseudoscientific theories by providing new material for selective interpretation. Climate science documenting dramatic environmental changes during glacial periods has proven particularly susceptible to Hyperborean misappropriation. Evidence that Arctic regions experience different climate conditions during various geological periods gets presented as supporting habitable Hyperborea, while research on ancient sea levels and ice sheet dynamics gets selectively quoted to make polar civilization seem physically plausible. Scientists studying these phenomena typically remain unaware their research gets weaponized for ideological purposes, creating ongoing challenges for science communication that must anticipate and preemptively address potential misinterpretations. The role of Hyperborean mythology within contemporary white nationalist movements has become more explicit as these movements gained confidence during the 2010s. Organizations like Identity Evropa and the Traditionalist Worker Party incorporated Hyperborean references into their propaganda materials, using polar mythology to establish ancient precedent for white racial consciousness and European unity. These groups typically avoided explicit Nazi references while maintaining Völkisch assumptions about racial hierarchy and the necessity of preserving European genetic heritage. The identitarian movement emerging from European New Right philosophy has proven particularly adept at deploying Hyperborean mythology within intellectual frameworks that avoid crude biological racism while maintaining essentialist assumptions about cultural and spiritual differences between races. Identitarian theorists present Hyperborea as a symbol of authentic European identity requiring protection from multiculturalism and immigration, using mythological language to discuss racial preservation in culturally sophisticated terms. This strategic deployment makes Hyperborean theories accessible to educated audiences who might reject explicit racism but find cultural nationalism appealing. Psychological research into why people believe extraordinary claims despite contrary evidence has increasingly focused on cases like Hyperborean mythology as examples of motivated reasoning and identity-protective cognition. Studies demonstrate that beliefs serving important psychological functions prove remarkably resistant to factual correction, because accepting contrary evidence would require abandoning not merely incorrect information, but entire frameworks of meaning and belonging. For white nationalists, rejecting Hyperborean mythology would mean surrendering mythological legitimacy for racial consciousness and acknowledging that their ideology lacks ancient precedent. The COVID-19 pandemic's disruption of normal social institutions accelerated online radicalization processes that often involved exposure to Hyperborean theories within broader alternative knowledge ecosystems. Individuals seeking explanations for social disruption encountered conspiracy theories that sometimes incorporated Hyperborean elements as historical background for contemporary conflicts. The pandemic's isolation effects made online communities particularly important for social connection, creating conditions where ideological content got consumed alongside social interaction, making critical evaluation less likely as acceptance of community beliefs became prerequisite for belonging. Understanding Hyperborea's contemporary functions requires recognizing it operates simultaneously as historical claim, spiritual metaphor, political symbol, and cultural product consumed for entertainment. These different functions often blur together in practice, with believers moving fluidly between treating Hyperborea as literal ancient civilization, symbolic representation of racial essence, and mythological framework for understanding contemporary politics. This functional flexibility makes Hyperborean mythology particularly resilient, because challenges to its historical accuracy don't necessarily undermine its value as symbol or metaphor. The future trajectory of Hyperborean mythology remains uncertain as cultural conflicts over race, identity, and belonging continue intensifying. Climate change may paradoxically strengthen Hyperborean theories, as Arctic ice melt reveals previously frozen landscapes, providing opportunities for claims about discovered evidence of polar civilization. Simultaneously, growing awareness of mythology's racist origins may limit its mainstream appeal, while concentrating belief among explicitly white nationalist audiences. The tension between these trends will likely produce increasingly divergent Hyperborean traditions, serving different cultural functions for different audiences. What remains certain is that Hyperborea will continue functioning as mythological resource people used to construct meaning, identity, and understanding of their place in cosmic and historical narratives. Whether approached as ancient truth requiring recovery, dangerous ideology demanding opposition, or fascinating case study in modern mythology, Hyperborea reveals how humans create and maintain beliefs serving needs beyond empirical accuracy, demonstrating mythology's persistent power, even in supposedly rational modern societies. The academic study of pseudo-archaeology and alternative history has developed sophisticated frameworks for understanding how and why claims like Hyperborean mythology gain traction, despite lacking empirical support. Cognitive anthropologist Pascal Boyer's research on religious belief transmission reveals that ideas spreading most successfully combine minimal counterintuitiveness with strong emotional resonance. Hyperborean mythology fits this pattern perfectly, presenting concepts just strange enough to feel profound while confirming existing intuitions about racial identity and historical injustice. The theory violates everyday assumptions about human origins, sufficiently to seem revelatory without requiring acceptance of completely impossible claims like magic or supernatural intervention. Archaeological methodology demonstrates why systematic excavation and analysis consistently fail to support Hyperborean claims while revealing actual human prehistory of remarkable complexity. Modern Arctic archaeology has documented extensive evidence of human adaptation to polar environments stretching back millennia, including sophisticated technologies for surviving extreme cold and exploiting marine resources. These genuine achievements of Arctic peoples bear no resemblance to Hyperborean mythology's advanced civilization, instead revealing gradual cultural development through innovation and environmental adaptation. The Dorset and Thule cultures of Arctic North America developed remarkable survival technologies without requiring explanation through mythical prehistoric empires. Paleoclimatology provides definitive evidence against habitable Arctic conditions during periods when Hyperborean civilizations supposedly flourished. Ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica reveal detailed climate records extending hundreds of thousands of years, documenting temperature fluctuations and atmospheric composition with precision that eliminates possibilities for temperate Arctic conditions during human existence. The Eemian interglacial period, approximately 120,000 years ago, represented the warmest conditions in recent geological history, yet even then, Arctic regions remained substantially colder than temperate zones, providing no support for polar paradise scenarios. Genetic evidence from ancient DNA analysis has revolutionized understanding of human population history, while simultaneously demolishing racial theories underlying Hyperborean mythology. Studies of Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes reveal complex patterns of interbreeding between archaic and modern human populations that contradict notions of pure racial lineages descending from ancient civilizations. Contemporary European populations show genetic contributions from multiple ancestral groups, including Western hunter-gatherers, early European farmers, and Yamnaya pastoralists, with no evidence for mysterious northern source population. This genetic diversity emerged through migration and mixture, rather than descent from racially pure ancestors. Linguistic paleontology attempts to reconstruct ancient cultures through systematic analysis of vocabulary and grammatical structures in related languages. Indo-European linguistics has achieved remarkable success in reconstructing aspects of Proto-Indo-European society through comparison of daughter languages, revealing pastoral economy, patriarchal social structure, and probable origin in Pontic-Caspian steppes. These reconstructions, based on rigorous comparative method, provide no support for Hyperborean theories, while demonstrating how linguistic evidence actually works when properly analyzed. The absence of Arctic-related vocabulary in reconstructed Proto-Indo-European particularly undermines claims about polar origins. Philosophy of science illuminates why Hyperborean theories fail as legitimate historical hypotheses through examination of what distinguishes science from pseudoscience. Karl Popper's falsificationism emphasizes that genuine scientific theories must make predictions potentially disconfirmed by evidence, while pseudosciences immunize themselves against refutation through ad hoc modifications and unfalsifiable claims. Hyperborean mythology exemplifies pseudoscientific reasoning by treating absence of evidence as evidence of conspiracy, while interpreting any ambiguous finding as confirmation. This methodological flexibility allows believers to maintain conviction regardless of empirical discoveries. The sociology of knowledge explores how social factors influence what communities accept as knowledge and truth. Robert Merton's norms of scientific practice, including universalism, communalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism, create institutional structures promoting reliable knowledge production through peer review and replication. Alternative history communities operate according to different norms that prioritize ideological conformity over empirical accuracy, creating echo chambers where Hyperborean claims circulate without serious critical evaluation. These divergent epistemological communities produce radically different conclusions about the past, because they employ fundamentally different standards for evaluating evidence. Media literacy education has become crucial for helping people evaluate historical claims critically in information environments saturated with pseudo-archaeological content. Effective media literacy instruction teaches students to evaluate source credibility, recognize logical fallacies, understand how evidence actually works in historical research, and appreciate why expert consensus deserves respect while remaining open to legitimate revision. These skills enable critical consumption of historical content without requiring specialized knowledge of every topic, providing intellectual tools for distinguishing serious scholarship from ideologically motivated pseudo-history. The digital humanities have created new methods for analyzing how alternative historical narratives spread through online networks and evolve through collective elaboration. Network analysis of social media discussions reveals how Hyperborean content circulates through interconnected communities, sharing other conspiracy theories and extremist ideologies, with individual users serving as bridges connecting different alternative knowledge ecosystems. Natural language processing of discussion forums shows how Hyperborean theories get modified through crowdsourced elaboration, with community members collectively developing increasingly complex mythologies that address objections and incorporate new supposed evidence. Comparative mythology reveals legitimate connections between cultures that require no recourse to Hyperborean diffusion theories. Joseph Campbell's monomyth concept, while controversial among professional folklorists, demonstrates how similar narrative patterns emerge across cultures through shared human psychology and common social needs. These structural parallels result from convergent cultural evolution rather than descent from common source, just as similar technologies emerge independently when societies face comparable challenges. The legitimate study of mythological patterns provides more satisfying explanations than pseudo-historical diffusion theories, while respecting cultural diversity and historical complexity. Archaeological ethics demand respect for indigenous peoples whose histories get appropriated by Hyperborean mythology for ideological purposes. Native Arctic peoples possess rich oral traditions and archaeological records documenting their genuine histories, which bear no relationship to racist fantasies about vanished white civilizations. The appropriation of indigenous sacred sites and artifacts for Hyperborean speculation represents cultural violence that denies indigenous people authority over their own heritage. Professional archaeology increasingly recognizes obligations to collaborate with descendant communities and challenge pseudo-archaeological narratives that erase indigenous histories. The psychology of conspiracy thinking illuminates why Hyperborean believers resist contrary evidence through mechanisms of cognitive self-protection. Research on motivated reasoning demonstrates that people process information differently depending on whether conclusions support or threaten existing beliefs, with threatening information triggering skeptical scrutiny while confirming information gets accepted uncritically. For individuals whose identity centers on Hyperborean beliefs, archaeological evidence against polar civilizations represents attack on self-concept rather than neutral information, triggering defensive responses that strengthen rather than weaken conviction. Education research on correcting misconceptions reveals that simply presenting facts rarely changes minds when beliefs serve important psychological functions. Effective approaches require understanding what needs beliefs fulfill and providing alternative frameworks that meet those needs while aligning with evidence. For Hyperborean believers seeking cultural identity and historical significance, effective counter-narratives must offer compelling visions of European history that acknowledge genuine achievements without requiring mythological ancestors or racial superiority. This therapeutic approach treats belief correction as psychological intervention rather than mere information provision. The relationship between academic history and public historical consciousness remains perpetually fraught as professional historians struggle to communicate complex research findings against simplified alternative narratives offering clear heroes, villains, and moral lessons. Academic history's commitment to nuance, contingency, and acknowledgement of evidentiary limitations makes it less immediately satisfying than pseudo-historical narratives providing certain answers to identity questions. This structural disadvantage in attention economy helps explain why Hyperborean mythology thrives despite academic refutation, as it offers narrative clarity and emotional satisfaction that careful scholarship cannot match. Memory studies examine how societies construct collective memories of the past that serve present identity needs, rather than accurately representing historical events. Hyperborean mythology functions as invented tradition, providing white nationalist movements with usable past that legitimizes contemporary political projects through claims of historical precedent. This instrumentalization of history transforms the past into a resource for present struggles, with accuracy mattering less than utility for mobilizing support and constructing group identity. Understanding this functional relationship between myth and politics reveals why factual correction alone cannot eliminate pseudo-historical beliefs. The commercialization of alternative history creates economic incentives for producing Hyperborean content regardless of truthfulness. Publishers, television networks, and online platforms profit from alternative history material that attracts audiences through sensationalism and controversy. This commercial logic encourages production of increasingly extreme claims that capture attention in crowded media environments, creating race to the bottom where accuracy gets sacrificed for engagement. The economic sustainability of pseudo-history industry ensures continuous production of Hyperborean content, even as individual claims get debunked. Post-colonial theory examines how European colonialism shaped knowledge production and created hierarchies privileging Western perspectives while marginalizing indigenous knowledge systems. Some post-colonial scholars argue that dismissing alternative histories as pseudoscience risks reproducing colonial power dynamics by insisting on Western scientific authority. However, this relativist position becomes problematic when applied to racist pseudo-history like Hyperborean mythology, which itself represents colonial knowledge production erasing indigenous histories. Critical evaluation of knowledge claims need not reproduce colonialism when it challenges rather than reinforces existing power structures. The future of historical literacy depends on educational systems' ability to teach critical thinking about the past, while acknowledging history's relevance for contemporary identity and politics. Effective history education must balance respect for evidence and methodology with recognition that historical knowledge serves present needs and gets constructed through interpretive processes. Students learning to think historically develop appreciation for complexity and contingency while maintaining ability to distinguish better from worse historical arguments. This sophisticated historical consciousness provides best defense against pseudo-historical manipulation. Digital archiving and data preservation ensure that evidence refuting Hyperborean claims remains accessible to future researchers and educators. Projects digitizing archaeological reports, making radiocarbon databases publicly available, and creating online repositories of peer-reviewed research democratize access to information previously limited to academic specialists. These resources enable interested individuals to verify claims independently, while providing teachers with materials for instructing students in evaluating historical evidence. The permanent accessibility of refuting evidence creates long-term barriers to Hyperborean mythology's mainstream acceptance. Interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, historians, geneticists, climatologists, and other specialists produces comprehensive understanding of human prehistory that leaves no space for Hyperborean civilizations. This collaborative knowledge production demonstrates science's power to answer fundamental questions about human origins through systematic investigation and evidence synthesis. The consilience of independent lines of evidence converging on similar conclusions about the past provides powerful validation of scientific methodology while revealing pseudo-history's inability to withstand scrutiny from multiple disciplinary perspectives. The role of museums and cultural institutions in presenting human prehistory carries responsibility for countering pseudo-archaeological narratives while making legitimate archaeology accessible and engaging. Effective museum exhibitions present scientific findings through compelling narratives and impressive visual presentations that compete with alternative history entertainment on aesthetic grounds while maintaining factual accuracy. Interactive displays allowing visitors to engage with archaeological methodology and evidence evaluation provide experiential understanding of how historical knowledge gets produced, building appreciation for scientific approaches. The persistence of Hyperborean mythology, despite overwhelming contrary evidence, ultimately reveals less about the past than about present needs for meaning, identity, and belonging that drive belief in comforting fictions. Every society creates origin myths that explain who they are and why they matter, with modern pseudo-history serving similar functions as ancient foundation legends. The difference lies in contemporary claims of scientific validity that demand critical scrutiny according to evidentiary standards that ancient myths never pretended to meet. Understanding why people believe in Hyperborea, despite its impossibility, requires empathy for human needs driving belief alongside unflinching commitment to empirical truth. The loneliness, anxiety, and search for significance that make alternative histories appealing deserve recognition, even as the beliefs themselves require rejection. Effective responses to pseudo-history must address both intellectual errors and emotional needs, providing not just corrections, but alternative frameworks for finding meaning. The academic consensus rejecting Hyperborean mythology rests on overwhelming evidence from multiple disciplines and represents hard-won knowledge about human prehistory that genuinely does reveal remarkable stories about our ancestors' achievements. These true stories of human adaptation, migration, innovation, and cultural development deserve celebration, not because they confirm nationalist ideologies, but because they reveal humanity's actual complexity and diversity. The real human past proves far more interesting than mythological fantasies once people develop capacity to appreciate history's genuine wonders. The contemporary fascination with ancient mysteries that produces Hyperborean speculation reveals fundamental tensions between scientific knowledge production and human meaning-making that transcend any particular pseudo-historical claim. These tensions emerge from legitimate questions about how societies construct historical narratives, who controls interpretation of the past, and whether objective historical truth exists independently of present concerns. Academic historians acknowledge that all historical interpretation involves selection and framing, influenced by contemporary perspectives, while maintaining that evidence constrains interpretation in ways that distinguish legitimate historical argument from fantasy. The difference between recognizing history's interpretive dimensions and embracing relativism that treats all narratives as equally valid determines whether societies can maintain shared factual foundations necessary for collective decision-making. Educational approaches addressing pseudo-history must navigate between dogmatic assertion of scientific authority that alienates skeptical audiences and false equivalence that treats fringe theories as deserving equal consideration with established knowledge. Effective science communication acknowledges uncertainty inherent in historical reconstruction, while explaining how evidence accumulation creates reliable knowledge despite incomplete information. Teachers who admit limitations of current understanding while demonstrating why certain conclusions remain firmly established build credibility that purely defensive responses to pseudo-history cannot achieve. This balanced approach requires confidence in scientific methodology combined with humility about specific claims. The psychological research on belief formation and maintenance illuminates why factual corrections often fail to change minds about cherished beliefs like Hyperborean mythology. Worldview protective cognition causes people to reject information threatening core identity commitments regardless of evidence quality. Backfire effects sometimes strengthen false beliefs when they face direct contradiction. Understanding these cognitive patterns suggests that effective responses require addressing underlying needs driving belief rather than simply providing corrections. People need alternative frameworks for understanding their place in history that satisfy emotional and social needs currently met by pseudo-historical narratives. The role of charismatic individuals in promoting pseudo-historical theories demonstrates how personal authority can substitute for empirical evidence in persuading audiences lacking tools for independent evaluation. Figures presenting themselves as maverick researchers, challenging corrupt academic establishments, appeal to anti-elitist sentiments, while their confidence and apparent erudition create impressions of expertise among non-specialist audiences. The parasocial relationships that develop between content creators and their audiences generate loyalty that survives factual corrections from outside sources. Addressing this dynamic requires building alternative sources of trusted information that can compete on emotional engagement while maintaining factual accuracy. The commercialization of alternative history through entertainment media, publishing, and tourism creates economic incentives for producing and promoting pseudo-historical content, regardless of its factual basis. Television networks earn profits from ancient mystery programming that attracts viewers seeking entertainment rather than education. Publishers profit from alternative history books that promise revolutionary revelations. Tour operators capitalize on sites associated with fringe theories. These economic structures ensure continuous production of new pseudo-historical content that academics must repeatedly address. Understanding these commercial dynamics reveals why debunking alone cannot eliminate pseudo-history when profitable industries depend on its continued production. The intersection of Hyperborean mythology with environmental and political movements creates complex situations where legitimate concerns become entangled with pseudo-historical claims. Groups advocating indigenous rights, environmental protection, or cultural preservation sometimes incorporate alternative historical narratives that support their causes. Critiquing the pseudo-history risks appearing to oppose the underlying political goals, creating dilemmas for scholars who support the causes but reject the historical claims. Navigating these situations requires distinguishing between political solidarity and historical accuracy, while demonstrating that legitimate causes need not rely on false historical foundations. The generational transmission of pseudo-historical beliefs within families and communities creates self-perpetuating cycles difficult to interrupt through external intervention. Children raised with Hyperborean mythology as assumed truth develop worldviews, incorporating these beliefs as foundational elements resistant to later revision. Community institutions reinforcing alternative histories through regular discussion and celebration embed these narratives in social identity. Breaking these cycles requires sustained educational intervention across multiple generations, combined with alternative community frameworks that can provide belonging without requiring adherence to false histories. The global spread of Hyperborean and similar mythologies through internet connectivity demonstrates how local pseudo-histories can achieve international reach and influence far beyond their origins. Ideas that might once have remained confined to small regional communities now find worldwide audiences through social media, creating transnational networks of believers who reinforce each other's convictions. This globalization of pseudo-history complicates responses that must now address not just local beliefs, but internationally coordinated movements with resources enabling sophisticated propaganda campaigns. The scale of this challenge requires equally coordinated international responses from scientific and educational communities. The documentation of ongoing archaeological research provides continuous refutation of Hyperborean claims as new discoveries consistently support conventional understanding of human prehistory, while revealing no evidence for lost advanced civilizations. Each new ancient DNA study mapping prehistoric population movements, each paleoclimatic reconstruction revealing past environmental conditions, each archaeological excavation documenting actual human societies from supposed Hyperborean periods adds to the overwhelming evidence contradicting alternative histories. The cumulative weight of this evidence makes Hyperborean mythology increasingly untenable for anyone seriously engaging with current research. The development of public archaeology initiatives that involve communities in actual archaeological research provides experiential understanding of how historical knowledge gets produced through systematic investigation. Participants in excavations, laboratory analysis, and interpretation learn firsthand about evidence evaluation, uncertainty management, and the slow accumulation of reliable knowledge through careful work. These experiences build appreciation for scientific methodology that abstract explanations cannot achieve, while demonstrating that real archaeology proves far more interesting than sensationalized alternatives once people develop capacity to appreciate subtle discoveries and complex interpretations. The preservation of cultural heritage sites threatened by looting, development, and climate change carries particular urgency given how pseudo-historical tourism sometimes damages actual archaeological remains. Sites associated with alternative theories attract visitors whose activities can destroy fragile archaeological evidence, while their beliefs about the site's significance may conflict with scientific understanding and indigenous cultural connections. Protecting these sites requires balancing public access with preservation needs, while ensuring that interpretation respects both scientific evidence and legitimate cultural claims without validating pseudo-historical fantasies. The long-term trajectory of pseudo-historical movements like Hyperborean mythology remains uncertain in rapidly changing information landscapes. Increased access to legitimate scholarship through digital resources may gradually erode support for alternative histories as more people develop tools for evaluating claims. Conversely, continued social fragmentation and declining trust in institutions might strengthen pseudo-historical communities that provide certainty and belonging unavailable elsewhere. The outcome depends partly on whether scientific and educational communities can develop more effective approaches to public engagement that compete successfully with alternative history entertainment while maintaining intellectual integrity. The responsibility of content creators, platform operators, and advertisers in amplifying or constraining pseudo-historical content raises difficult questions about free expression, commercial incentives, and social responsibility. Platforms hosting alternative history content profit from engagement it generates while potentially contributing to public misinformation. Content creators may genuinely believe claims they promote, or may cynically exploit audience credulity for financial gain. Advertisers support pseudo-historical content through revenue that makes its production profitable. Addressing these systemic issues requires coordination among multiple stakeholders with potentially conflicting interests and values. The comparison between contemporary pseudo-history and historical examples of nationalist mythologies that enabled political movements with catastrophic consequences provides sobering context for current debates. The uses of invented histories to justify territorial expansion, ethnic cleansing, and authoritarian rule demonstrate that false beliefs about the past can have devastating real-world consequences. While most Hyperborean believers pose no similar threats, the underlying dynamics of mythological thinking that subordinates evidence to ideology remain concerning. Vigilance against pseudo-history's political weaponization requires understanding how seemingly harmless alternative histories can evolve into dangerous nationalist ideologies under particular social and political conditions. The intersection of Hyperborean mythology with broader conspiracy theories about suppressed knowledge and institutional corruption reveals how alternative histories function within larger frameworks of distrust and alienation from mainstream society. Believers often connect Hyperborean claims to theories about academic conspiracies, government cover-ups, and hidden agendas that supposedly explain why conventional scholarship rejects their beliefs. These meta-narratives about knowledge suppression prove more resistant to evidence than specific historical claims, because they explain away all contradictory information as products of conspiracy. Addressing these deeper frameworks requires rebuilding trust in institutions and expertise, rather than simply correcting particular factual errors. The future of public understanding about human prehistory depends significantly on whether scientific communities can communicate complex archaeological and genetic findings in accessible ways that satisfy human needs for engaging narratives about the past. The remarkable true stories emerging from prehistoric research deserve celebration and wider dissemination through compelling presentations that rival alternative history entertainment in production quality and emotional resonance. Archaeologists, geneticists, and historians possess raw material for fascinating narratives about actual human achievements that require only effective communication to compete successfully with pseudo-historical fantasies in the marketplace of ideas. The ongoing dialogue between academic specialists and interested publics about human origins, cultural development, and historical interpretation ultimately serves democracy by modeling how societies can maintain shared factual foundations while accommodating diverse perspectives and interpretations. This dialogue requires scholars to explain their methods and findings accessibly, while audiences develop critical thinking skills, enabling independent evaluation of competing claims. The health of democratic societies depends partly on citizens' capacity to distinguish reliable knowledge from attractive fictions, making education in historical thinking a civic necessity rather than merely academic concern. The recognition that all humans share common ancestry, revealed through genetic research, provides powerful counter-narrative to Hyperborean and similar mythologies that imagine fundamental differences between populations. The scientific evidence demonstrating that all modern humans descend from common African ancestors, and that genetic variation within populations exceeds variation between them, contradicts racial hierarchies and civilizational superiority claims that motivate much pseudo-historical speculation. Emphasizing our shared human story while celebrating actual cultural diversity offers alternative framework for understanding history that satisfies needs for identity and belonging without requiring false claims about the past. The wonder and mystery that draw people to alternative histories need not be sacrificed to embrace evidence-based understanding of the past. Real human history contains genuine mysteries, remarkable achievements, and fascinating stories that inspire awe when approached with openness to complexity and ambiguity. The migrations that populated every continent, the independent invention of agriculture in multiple regions, the development of writing systems and monumental architecture, the transmission of cultural knowledge across generations. These actual human accomplishments deserve celebration precisely because they represent real people solving real problems through ingenuity and cooperation. The choice facing contemporary societies involves not whether to embrace mystery and wonder about tea, he passed, but whether to ground that wonder in reality or fantasy. Or, human curiosity about origins and ancient mysteries represents healthy impulse toward understanding our place in the long story of life on Earth. This curiosity becomes problematic only when it rejects evidence in favor of comforting fictions, or when it serves ideologies that harm contemporary communities. The same impulse driving people toward Hyperborean mythology could, with proper guidance, lead them toward genuine appreciation for the actual human past revealed through careful research. The challenge for educators and communicators involves channeling that curiosity toward productive engagement with real evidence, while acknowledging the limitations and uncertainties that characterize all historical knowledge. Meeting this challenge requires patience, empathy, and commitment to both tar and human dignity that recognizes why people seek meaning in the past, while insisting that meaning must be grounded in reality. Human nature's tendency to create meaningful narratives from fragmentary evidence serves us well in many contexts, but can lead us astray when dealing with deep time and complex prehistory that resist simple stories. We evolved to recognize patterns, infer causation, and construct coherent narratives from incomplete information. Cognitive abilities that enabled survival, but that can generate false certainty about the past when not disciplined by systematic methodology. Understanding these cognitive tendencies helps explain pseudo-history's appeal, while suggesting how education might cultivate more sophisticated historical thinking that embraces uncertainty and complexity. The goal involves not eliminating our narrative impulse, but refining it through critical awareness of how we construct historical understanding and what evidence can and cannot tell us about the past. Human ingenuity, adaptability, and creativity revealed through actual archaeological evidence far exceeds anything imagined in Hyperborean fantasies. That truth alone should inspire sufficient wonder to make mythology unnecessary. The archaeological and genetic evidence stands unmoved by centuries of speculation. No polar civilization existed. No advanced Hyperborean race seeded human culture. The Arctic during human existence remained exactly what current evidence shows: harsh, sparsely populated, and inhabited by peoples who developed remarkable survival technologies through gradual innovation rather than inherited ancient wisdom. Every ice core sample, every genetic study, every systematic excavation confirms the conventional understanding while revealing not a single artifact, not one structure, not a shred of physical evidence supporting Hyperborean claims. This absence isn't oversight or suppression, it reflects reality. Archaeologists would celebrate discovering evidence for unknown advanced civilizations. Such findings would revolutionize understanding and make careers. The conspiracy theories claiming academics hide evidence misunderstand how science actually works. Competition between researchers, institutional rivalries, and the fame attending major discoveries create incentives for revealing rather than concealing revolutionary findings. The reason no one has found Hyperborea isn't because it's hidden, but because it never existed outside imagination. Yet the myth persists precisely because it serves needs unrelated to historical accuracy. People seeking cultural identity, racial superiority narratives, or spiritual meaning find in Hyperborea whatever their psychology requires. The theory's unfalsifiability becomes advantage rather than weakness for believers who can interpret any absence of evidence as evidence of conspiracy. This makes Hyperborean mythology essentially religious rather than historical, operating through faith rather than investigation. The transformation from ancient philosophical concept to modern racist ideology demonstrates how profoundly contexts alter meaning. Greeks using Hyperborea as thought experiment about ideal society could not have imagined Volkish movements weaponizing their speculation to justify genocide. This historical irony should caution against assuming our own appropriations of ancient material remain innocent. Every generation believes itself recovering authentic meaning, while actually projecting contemporary concerns onto ancient texts that meant something entirely different in their original contexts. The real human story emerging from legitimate research proves vastly more interesting than Hyperborean fantasies once people develop capacity to appreciate actual complexity. The peopling of every continent through successive migrations, the independent development of agriculture in multiple regions, the invention of writing systems and complex social organization without requiring lost civilizations or alien intervention. These genuine achievements deserve celebration precisely because real humans accomplished them through ingenuity and adaptation. Our ancestors' actual capabilities exceeded what Hyperborean mythology imagines while remaining fully human rather than superhuman. Modern Europeans seeking cultural pride need not invent mythological ancestors. The actual archaeological record reveals sophisticated societies throughout European prehistory who developed remarkable technologies for thriving in diverse environments. The megalithic builders who constructed Stonehenge and Newgrange, the Bronze Age traders who connected distant regions through exchange networks, the Iron Age communities who developed complex political systems. These real ancestors accomplished extraordinary things without requiring descent from Hyperborean supermen. Their achievements become more rather than less impressive when we acknowledge they were ordinary humans facing real challenges rather than inheritors of lost wisdom. The persistence of Hyperborean belief despite overwhelming contrary evidence reveals uncomfortable truths about how humans actually form and maintain beliefs. We are not primarily rational creatures who follow evidence to conclusions. We are social beings who adopt beliefs that serve identity needs, tribal affiliations, and psychological comfort, regardless of empirical support. Effective responses to pseudo-history must acknowledge these realities while still insisting that evidence matters. The challenge involves meeting emotional needs that pseudo-history addresses while building appreciation for how systematic investigation actually produces reliable knowledge. Education represents the only long-term solution, though not education that merely presents facts expecting automatic acceptance. People need experiential understanding of how historical knowledge gets constructed through evidence evaluation, competing interpretations, and gradual consensus formation. They need appreciation for uncertainty and ambiguity that characterizes all historical reconstruction. They need recognition that admitting ignorance about some questions represents intellectual honesty rather than weakness. This sophisticated historical consciousness takes years to develop, but provides lasting immunity to pseudo-historical manipulation. The Internet's role in spreading Hyperborean mythology demonstrates both the democratization of knowledge and its dangers. Access to information increases while simultaneously enabling unprecedented dissemination of misinformation to audiences lacking tools for evaluation. Digital literacy becomes as crucial as traditional literacy for navigating information landscapes where professional scholarship and conspiracy theories present themselves with equal confidence. Learning to evaluate sources, recognize logical fallacies, and understand how evidence works in different disciplines represents survival skills for contemporary citizens. The comparison between Hyperborea and other origin myths throughout human history reveals patterns that transcend particular cases. Every culture creates stories explaining where they came from and why they matter. These narratives serve crucial psychological and social functions that won't disappear regardless of scientific advancement. The question becomes whether modern societies can satisfy these needs through frameworks that acknowledge rather than deny evidence. Can we create meaningful origin stories that inspire pride without requiring false superiority claims? Can we find significance in actual human achievements rather than invented ones? The scientific consensus rejecting Hyperborean mythology doesn't represent dogmatic closure against new evidence. Legitimate discoveries that challenge conventional understanding would be investigated, debated, and eventually accepted if evidence warranted. This has happened repeatedly throughout archaeological history, as new methods revealed previously unknown aspects of the human past. The difference between scientific revision and pseudo-historical speculation lies in methodology and evidence standards. Science remains open to revision while maintaining rigorous evaluation criteria. Pseudo-history accepts anything supporting desired conclusions, while rejecting anything contradictory. The future relationship between academic knowledge and public belief about the past depends significantly on whether scholars can communicate effectively beyond specialist audiences. The remarkable discoveries emerging from contemporary research deserve wider dissemination through compelling narratives that rival alternative history entertainment in production quality and emotional resonance. Archaeologists and historians possess raw material for fascinating stories about actual human achievements requiring only effective presentation to compete successfully with pseudo-historical fantasies. The responsibility for maintaining accurate historical understanding extends beyond academics to include media producers, educators, platform operators, and citizens who must develop critical thinking capacities, enabling evaluation of competing claims. This represents collective challenge requiring cooperation across institutions and recognition that truth about the past matters for present decisions. Societies building policies on false historical foundations risk catastrophic mistakes visible throughout history, when nationalist mythologies enabled movements with devastating consequences. The wonder and mystery properly attending human prehistory need not be sacrificed to embrace evidence-based understanding. Real human history contains genuine unknowns, remarkable achievements, and fascinating questions that inspire awe without requiring invented civilizations or supernatural explanations. The migrations that populated Earth, the independent invention of complex technologies, the development of diverse cultures adapted to every environment. These actual accomplishments reveal humanity's extraordinary adaptability and creativity. Our ancestors were not superhuman, but their achievements remain genuinely super when understood as products of ordinary human ingenuity applied to real challenges. The choice facing individuals encountering Hyperborean claims involves deciding whether comfort of certainty outweighs commitment to truth. Pseudo-history offers clear answers, ancient legitimacy for modern concerns, and communities providing belonging through shared belief. Academic history offers uncertainty, complexity, and the discomfort of acknowledging how much remains unknown. Yet only the latter represents intellectual honesty, and only the latter provides foundation for sound decisions about present and future. The temporary comfort of false certainty cannot justify abandoning evidence-based reasoning that distinguishes reliable knowledge from attractive fantasy. Understanding why Hyperborean mythology persists requires empathy for human needs, driving belief without surrendering commitment to empirical truth. People seeking meaning, identity, and significance deserve recognition even when their beliefs require rejection. Effective responses must address both intellectual errors and emotional needs, providing not merely corrections, but alternative frameworks for finding purpose and belonging grounded in reality rather than fantasy. This difficult balance represents ongoing challenge for democratic societies that must maintain shared factual foundations while respecting diverse perspectives and interpretations. The real human past, revealed through systematic investigation, proves far more interesting than mythological fantasies once people develop capacity to appreciate genuine complexity and ambiguity. Every archaeological discovery, every genetic study, every careful analysis of ancient remains adds detail to the remarkable story of how our species spread across the planet, adapted to diverse environments, and developed the cultural complexity characterizing modern humans. This true story deserves celebration, not because it confirms nationalist ideologies, but because it reveals humanity's actual diversity, ingenuity, and shared heritage that transcends the invented divisions pseudo-history promotes. Human curiosity about origins represents healthy impulse toward understanding our place in the long story of life on Earth. That curiosity becomes destructive only when it rejects evidence in favor of comforting fictions or when it serves ideologies harming contemporary communities. The challenge for educators involves channeling natural curiosity toward productive engagement with real evidence, while acknowledging limitations and uncertainties characterizing all historical knowledge. Meeting this challenge requires patience, empathy, and commitment to both truth and human dignity, recognizing why people seek meaning in the past, while insisting that meaning must be grounded in reality rather than fantasy that ultimately serves neither truth nor the human communities it claims to celebrate.